You know, it's only in an upside-down world where telling the truth will get you the most hate. How dare you speak the truth? I want to big shout out to my buddy. He's had the Nikon Z9 now for nearly a month. I talked to him about the Z9. Gave me a lot of interesting information. Some of it was amazingly good, but there was a significant amount that was quite the opposite. So I'd like to talk about facts, not what I think, feel, or believe about the Nikon Z9 camera, and also too make some important observations about Nikon flagship cameras. Okay? Let me first start off by saying that as someone has spent more money on Nikon gear than any of you, and I'm not stating that as a brag and have Nikon tattooed on my body for the rest of my life, I am not a Nikon hater. I have still hundreds of Nikon lenses, and I've always been and grew up as a Nikon fanboy, so let's get that stated from the outset if you've not seen the fact that I've made countless thousands of videos on gear reviews and have the best track record on lens recommendations. So there's no mechanical shutter in the Nikon Z9. That's good in that as a former camera repair person, that's the #1 failure point in any camera. However, the fact that there's no mechanical shutter creates another issue. I'll let you guess what that is. 45.7 megapixels, the stacked CMOS sensor, takes CF Express cards, which have the potential of being incredibly fast. However, there's a serious issue on this one, and others are reporting it, so you can't say I'm wrong about this fact. There are other people that are reporting this. I actually found a video where others were reporting this. But thanks to my friend for giving me the details on this camera. Has quite a nasty optical low-pass filter. I didn't see that aliasing was an issue on finer details, as he said. He gave me a few images of some action shots that he took. 1,340 grams. It's really heavy. It's well within range of the Nikon D6. Only, I think, about 60 grams lighter, so it takes the huge ENAL18 batteries. And there's a reason for this. It has a very poor 60 frame per second EVF refresh rate. Even though I can't stand Sony for countless valid empirical reasons, 60 frames per second is a horrible refresh rate, and there's a reason for that, and I'll actually get that into a second, because people are forgetting on a mirrorless camera, especially one that's designed for hardcore sports action wildlife, the processor is trying to do two things: do analog to digital conversion. All sensors, by the way, are analog sensors. In a digital camera, every digital camera on Earth, they're all analog sensors. There's actually a famous interview that someone had with the Tower Jazz guy that's managing Tower Jazz, and he's talking. Some guy's asking about digital sensors. The guy says, "Back up a minute. There's no such thing as a digital sensor. Digital camera and digital conversion is what happens and how the data is stored, but there's no such thing as a digital sensor." So that's a point that a lot of you fail to realize. But the processor in this camera is feeding and processing data to the EVF, yeah, because there's not one of these anymore in it. There's no pentaprism in it, so it's processing analog to digital conversion to go to the chip, to the compact flash express card. Is processing data for autofocus, and is processing data to go to the EVF. That's the reason for that. So no mech shutter. That's both good and bad. No mech shutter. Mechanical shutter exists for a reason. However, with this new stacked CMOS sensor, it gets around a lot of that, but it doesn't get around all of it. Obviously, this is not a camera that's highly desirable for mixed lighting flash photography because there's no mechanical shutter. But this is not designed as a studio camera. If you wanted a studio camera, you'd be buying a GFX, obviously so. I'm actually surprised in a good way at the price of $5,500. I thought it'd be $6,000 to $7,000, but it's $5,500, so that's good. Downside, of course, is that most Pro Glass has to be adapted to this camera, even though they're starting to roll out more Z lenses. Those like me and countless others that have enormous amount of F-mount glass, we're stuck with an adapter. Yeah, and none of the Screwdrive lenses, of course, will work on this camera. There's no Screwdrive, nor is there, even with the new FTZ adapter Mark II, there's no Screwdrive capability. None. So, Here's an issue on this camera. No Nikon flagship camera has ever had a moving LCD. Why? Because it requires a feed cable. That feed cable requires a hole in the backplate. And every camera out there, 99% of them actually, have the main board sitting right behind the magnesium backplate. And when you introduce a hole, that means you end up with humidity and condensation, infiltration. No matter how well you rubber gasket it, you have a flexi cable that's feeding the LCD, which is, you know, feeding the LCD on the Nikon Z9, just like this one here, yeah? There's a flexi cable feeding it. So that's a downside. No Nikon flagship camera has ever had that. Here's the serious issue on the Nikon Z9, which is a total bummer. 20 frames per second full RAW. Even the Canon R3 can do 30, yeah? Buffer also too, and the Canon R3 is much deeper, so 30 frames per second. Now it can do 30 frames per second in full JPEG, well wonderful, and 120 frames per second in 11 megapixel JPEG. But 20 frames per second full-blown RAW, that's a bummer on a Nikon flagship camera. That's just, and I know the reason why. It's the same reason, the three-point reason I told you. What the processor is trying to do is trying to do analog to digital conversion, feed the EVF, and there's that neat little thing that has to process autofocus. I don't know if many of you realize that autofocus is one of the things the processor has to do. So just think about that. No matter how, whether it's a dual processor or how fast the processor is, yeah, just think of all a processor has to do. However, Nikon has failed in this relative to Sony, which I can't stand Sony at all. It failed at it relative to Sony's year-and-a-half-old camera, which could do way better than this, and Canon's R3. Okay, whatever you think of me or whatever you think of Nikon, Nikon has failed at this. The price point is nice at $5,500, but that is a failure. Here's the biggest failure of all. And every Nikon, are you listening? I bet there are people on that Nikon fan page, the site where rumors are talked about amongst the Nikon peeps. Peep, 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 Nikon, peep, peep, Nikon's the best. Every one of those people, are you listening? Every one of those people has been saying for over a year now that the new Nikon flagship camera, yeah, it'll be, $6,000-7,000, which is cheaper than that. We'll have a bottomless buffer. It'll be using compact CF Express cards, dual, which it is. The development saying it has to have a bottomless buffer. Here's the fact. Using the fastest CF Express cards, my buddy who's had the camera now for nearly a month, and others are reporting this too online, so don't accuse me of stating something incorrect. Others are reporting this as well. 35 shots to 40 shots before the buffer chokes. I'm not laughing because that's fun. Well, it is kind of funny. Of all the things at Nikon, now you can get a deeper buffer if you're shooting JPEGs, which is wonderful, but if you want to be shooting RAWs, can't process that information fast enough. It can't. Here, let me restate this again, because none of these fools out there that are talking about cameras and they've all got affiliate links, and I have no affiliate links. None of these people realize, they've never mentioned it in any video, is that processor is processing autofocus, feeding and processing data to the EVF, and doing analog to digital conversion. Because, let me state it again, there is no such thing, listen closely, there is no such thing as a digital camera sensor. They're all analog. Every one of them in every camera. There's no such thing as a digital sensor. Digital is what is processed from the analog signal of a sensor in a digital camera. Okay, so the processors are doing a lot. 35 shots to 40 shots. I heard mostly it's 35 actually. 30, my buddy told me it's 35. Thanks to my buddy, by the way, for telling me so much about the Nikon Z9. It was some shockingly good things, not shockingly, some good things that I wasn't expecting, like the price point. But some really bad, shocking things like this. 35 shots before that camera chokes. He found it shocking, and so did I, that there is an enormous amount of real estate on the top of the camera, directly right of the LCD. There's just nothing there. There's not like one button, it's only got one button. It had room for 3, which it does. There's nothing there. Now the camera does have a lot of buttons, but every camera company will agree, and anybody with a half a brain will agree, that the top right of any camera, that real estate is insanely important. That's where you put some important function buttons. There ain't none there. There's none there. So tell me how you did that, Nikon. Now, it's a huge camera, and it does have a lot of buttons on it, but the most important ones are at the top right of the LCD, and there's none there. Here's the really shocking point, and the second worst after the buffer choking after 35 shots, okay? Inferior autofocus. I've been told by my buddy, is a serious Nikon shooter, hardcore sports action. I don't want to give away who he is. 15% worse, he says, than his Nikon D6. 15%. Well, how's that possible? Nikon D6 has a flappy mirror, and it doesn't have as many autofocus points. Yes, that is true. This is true. But he says 15%. His beloved 300mm f4 face Fresnel was roughly 20% worse. However, face and eye detect autofocus are way better than the Nikon Z6 or Z7 Mark II. Once again, this camera is like, well, how could it be? It's got more autofocus points than a Nikon D5 or D6. How could it be worse autofocus? Because what a mirrorless camera has that a flappy mirror camera, I humorously call them flappy mirror camera, doesn't have, is that there's no image processing for EVF, because it's not an EVF. It uses this neat little antique thing that doesn't require any power and no processing power. I don't know if you know what this is. It's called pentaprism. You ever seen this? This is out of a Nikon camera, by the way. This is called a pentaprism. Yeah, it's a piece of glass. It's optical precision glass. It doesn't require power. And simplicity is divinity. It doesn't require power. It doesn't require processing power. So, let me state 3 immutable facts about Nikon, since I know more about Nikon than you do. If you think that's arrogant, I don't care. Here's a fact. Undeniable fact. Here's 3 of them. No Nikon flagship camera, whether it be the D3, D4, D4S, D5, D6, no Nikon flagship ever sold high numbers. Why? Because they're Nikon flagship cameras designed for hardcore pro-working photographers, and most photographers are, clickmeisters. They're buying, and the D500 is incredible. I'm shooting this video on a Nikon D500. People that own D850s, D500s, D700s, D7200s, no Nikon flagship camera ever sold high numbers. So even if this camera was absolutely everything, and it is absolutely not, from the undeniable facts that I stated about it, it would never ever sell high numbers, because no Nikon flagship camera ever sold high numbers. In this climate where everybody's getting fired, losing their jobs, and struggling to stay alive, and nobody's allowed to basically travel anymore, I don't care if you agree with that, it's essentially nobody's traveling anymore, yeah? A lot of photography is traveling. There are people with, I got a lot of money, I can buy whatever I want. Not me. They'll buy a flagship camera and travel with it. In this climate, and also too, the photography world is imploded. In this camera market where the photography world is imploded, this camera ain't going to save Nikon's backside. It's not going to save their bacon. Not a chance in hell. It's impossible. Can't happen. So there are a few good things about these. Super superior eye autofocus and face detect. $5,500 decent price on a flagship camera. It is heavy as hell, but that's fine. I actually love heavy cameras. Inferior autofocus, the buffer chokes out at 35 plus frames at full RAW. It chokes out. It's like, well, how could that? All of these Nikon fanboys, please God, let me make this point succinctly clear. All these Nikon fanboys have known the Nikon Z9 was coming for over a year now. It's going to have a bottomless buffer, full RAW. It doesn't even have anything close to that. Well, it's going to have CF Express cards, fastest ever, super fast, which they are. It's going to have a bottomless buffer. With the magical processor that's in the Z9, it cannot do all these things at once. Autofocus, feed the EVF, do analog to digital conversion, and buffer all that data. Did people realize, no one ever talks about this, that processor in that little camera relative to, say, a super big old computer. Can do all that stuff at once. It can't handle it. At least not a Nikon. Because Canons will do 30 frame per second. Yeah, and it'll only do 20 frame per second raw. You know, Canon and Sony could do a lot better than that, so Nikon's new flagship can't even come within 10 frames per second of Sony and Canon. So, buffer chokes out way too soon. Inferior autofocus, because since now, instead of this, you actually have to process data that feeds the EVF. Yeah, because this is a piece of glass. When you remove this piece of glass, and I have a lot of mirrorless cameras. Here's my favorite mirrorless camera of all. Well, my GFX cameras are my favorite. You know, here's a mirrorless camera. Huge fan of mirror. When you take this out of a camera, this piece of glass that doesn't require processing power and a processor, and it doesn't require energy. When you take that out, you have to replace it with processing and the draw of energy. So. It's got a moving LCD, and I know why they wanted a moving LCD. They pressed Nikon to do that. But Nikon flagship cameras have never had a moving LCD because it opens up the back plate to humidity infiltration, which causes corrosion on the main board, which causes failure. That's the main reasons why Sony's corrode out. They got a nice big hole for that flexi cable. Even though it's got a rubber gasket around it, there's still an air gap that lets humidity get in directly to the main board. As someone that fixed cameras for ages, I actually know stuff about that. So, what can we state about the undeniable empirical facts of the Nikon Z9 camera? Is it a failure? No, but it comes pretty close to it. Chokes at 35, only 20 frames per second. It has a failure point of a moving LCD, but it has a removed failure point of no mechanical shutter. But no mechanical shutter also, too, causes another issue. You ain't going to buy this camera for flash photography. Even though it'll do flash photography, you would not even think about buying this camera for flash photography. No way. Nobody in their right mind that knows anything about cameras would buy it for that. Also, too, this camera, most of the great glass, I said most, requires an adapter. People are adverse to buying an expensive camera where most of the glass requires an adapter. I don't care if you think about that, it's a fact. So this is a near failure from Nikon, and this is not going to financially save Nikon's bacon. And let me please reiterate the fact that no Nikon flagship camera ever sold high numbers relative to the cameras that they produced. Never has. Neither is the case with Canon. Most Canon sales are not their flagship cameras. It's not just Nikon, it's Canon and everybody else. No Nikon or any flagship camera from any camera company, you know, it's a high price, $6,000 plus roughly, ever sold high numbers. So there we have it, the near failure Nikon Z9. And all those Nikon peeps, it's going to have a bottomless buffer, I know it will. It's not even close to a bottomless buffer. Wait for it. Wait for it. Nikon.